Welcome to Sparks of History, where Jewish history and world history meet. We are extremely pleased to have with us today Rabbi Dr. Michael Berger. Professor Berger received his BA from Princeton University, master's degrees from Columbia, as well as a PhD from Columbia University. Professor Berger was granted rabbinic ordination, semicha, by Yeshivat Har Etzion, and received a Lady Davis Post-Doctoral Fellowship at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Professor Berger currently serves as Professor of Religion at Emory College, and his research and teaching focus on the development of Jewish law and ethics, issues of medieval and modern Jewish thought, and more recently, the formation of contemporary Jewish identity. Professor Berger is the author of Rabbinic Authority. Additionally, Professor Berger edited The Emergence of Ethical Man, based on the writings of the Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik of blessed memory, and also edited Return and Renewal, based on the oral discourses of Harav Aharon Lichtenstein of blessed memory. Professor Berger, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it very much.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
We'll get right started in what will be a fascinating topic. What is meant by a Darwinian approach to history?
So I admit that the choice of term is a little bit of an attention grabber, but I've been teaching the history of Judaism and Jewish law for 30 years. And a lot of the assigned readings that I could find gave students the impression that Judaism was always reacting to the world around it. Whether it was Hellenism, so some Jews, reacted in a way to become more assimilated, whether it was with emancipation to create Reform Judaism or conservative Judaism, or even Haredi, it's a response to external stimuli, if you will, or interactions. And Kabbalah was interacting with, in terms of the Zohar, with movements, ideas, intellectual trends around it. And I felt strongly that students weren't really coming away with an appreciation that religious life on its own terms has more agency. People are doing things because they want to explore, develop, create new ways of talking about a relationship with the transcendent or with God or with texts. So even somebody like Maimonides, he was influenced by Aristotelianism, so he's just looking for a way to integrate it with Rabbinic Judaism. I wanted students here at Emory, graduate as well as undergraduate, to appreciate that there's always a lot of variety in the religious landscape of any particular group or tradition. And I'll give a couple of examples, but my main thing that I wanted them to take away was, quite naturally, there are people, groups, leaders, perhaps, exploring new ways of trying to live out their religious life as fully as possible in their environment. But then what ends up happening, inevitably, depending on how much time, but inevitably, some of those pathways, some of those directions prove to be more fertile, more adaptive, or what I think is more appropriate for a particular time, and others cease to be, or fall into a position of a much smaller minority. So just let's take 3 examples. So when I teach the history of the late Second Temple period and the early Rabbinic period, so historians often say, like, well, it was in the Second Temple period. Some follow Josephus, that the Pharisees were very popular. Others say other groups were really dominant, those connected with the temple, like the Sadducees. And then everything is destroyed with the 70, when the Romans conquered Jerusalem. Here we're talking right after Tisha B'Av, right? There's a Chorban, and the rabbis step into the breach and develop a new form of Judaism. These are the books that you would find. And it's not temple centered. Of course, it acknowledges a temple, but it's based on the Beit Knesset, the synagogue, and prayer and Torah study, so the Beit Midrash, and these are all replacements for the Beit HaMikdash, the destroyed temple. And I thought, first of all, I don't think that's the way it happened. Second, I don't think it makes it sound like Rabbinic Judaism is a response to Chorban, as if it was almost non-existent or not so relevant. And what I want to argue is there's always, as I said earlier, a variety of types of Judaism, flavors, shades, perhaps even movements within the Jewish people. So the late Second Temple period, because of its political structure, because of its geographic distribution, we have a variety of forms of Judaism that are being tested, and some of them are even finding some rootedness in the Jewish life of the late Second Temple period. The Qumran sect, in the Judean hills, they're trying to figure out, in this time of political turmoil, in this time of certain kind of political oppression by Rome, but also a cosmopolitanism, a true economic flourishing that started in the time of, before Herod, and then certainly through Herod, where Jerusalem is becoming a regional hub and commercial center and cultural center. And you have a lot of people kind of coming through, and they want to withdraw to the wilderness, sort of, not monastic exclusively, but withdrawing from society in order to wait, for an eschatological end. At the same time, you have Therapeuti in Egypt, who are developing a more philosophical understanding of Judaism. Philo probably is in that milieu. When you come back to the land of Israel, we also have those who are very temple-centered, like the Sadducees. And then there are probably a lot of people who are just living life with the basic symbol set, and they don't eat pork, and they don't really do work on Shabbat. And we know this from Greek and Roman and Latin sources that that was pretty common at that time. Comes the Second Temple's destruction, but more significantly, the Bar Kokhba revolt. And what ends up happening is, as I try to present it to my students, is that other forms of Judaism are either losing adherents. So in the revolt in northern, in Egypt, that ends up really being a pogrom and wiping out a good part of Alexandrian Jewry. The Jews living there, right, basically disappear, that from what we know. And so the form of Judaism, perhaps Hellenistic, whether it was a whole movement, it's hard to know, but they just lose adherents. So it's not that it was a failed movement inherently. It just lost the form of life that would have made it most appropriate, which was they were accepted, they were part of the wider society, and they believed in the kind of synthesis that Hellenistic Judaism offered them. Clearly, anybody still hanging their hopes on an imminent return of the temple, it's not that they failed, they just didn't gain enough traction and adherence to be sustainable over the long period that began in the mid-second century.
And why is this called Darwinian? Like what?
So what I would like to establish is that, as Darwin explained in terms of biology, there's always mutation going on. There's always some kind of variegation going on. But then there is, air quotes, a natural selection happening at the same time, not because a movement is more successful, as if they had consultants coming in and doing strategic planning with them, and getting a good marketing, you need a brand. And that's this idea that every decision taken by religious groups is a function of meeting the current needs and adapting. I wanted to, on the one hand, give more agency to people who just want to live a religious life as they see fit, their ideal way of expressing their Judaism, living out their Judaism, passing on their Judaism, and the conditions that they may or may not control. Usually they do not control. So just to jump way ahead, I teach the 19th century and the development of the Reform movement in Germany and positive historical Judaism, and that became the conservative movement in America. And then, of course, neo-Orthodoxy that in some way took the form modern or centrist Orthodoxy in America. And then, of course, the Haredi the rejectionist view of integration into modern secular German life and what that meant in America. And so I then talked to the students, why did reform flourish in 19th century America? Not what did they do, but let's flip it and talk about the conditions that made a Judaism that did not depend on large numbers, that did not depend on strict practice. So rather than saying reform succeeded, it's that many American Jews, or most of them immigrants, that came and followed the westward expansion. If they were given choices of how to live, what kind of Judaism would they most resonate with or choose to adopt as fitting their lives, and even allowing them to embrace a Jewish identity in very, very positive terms. So for a lot of my students who at least know about the conservative movement and its changed fortunes over the last 100 years, right? They were at the high water mark, mid-20th century. My aim in teaching it this way is not to say that conservative Judaism was the best Judaism, right? And now it's fallen and it's come on hard times and it's failing. That's not the right way to think about it. It's better to think about it in terms of what were the conditions in mid-20th century America that fostered and encouraged more Jews to feel that they were at home in the conservative movement, in conservative synagogues. And I'm talking about sort of the residual old-time religion of their grandparents, that it had the appeal, it had the image, it had the aesthetics, it had the language of more traditional ritual. But it also allowed them to integrate and Americanize, because in the 40s and 50s, boy, that was the call, right, to Americanize. We're not near the immigration law of the mid-60s. We're not into counterculture. We're not into the 1980s multiculturalism. Like, all these things haven't happened yet. So conservative Judaism, and let's not forget that the majority of Americans were churched. So Jews want to be churched also, in the sense that they're looking for an affiliation that matches their sensibilities and their and their preferences for life. It's the high watermark for mainline Protestant Christianity. And which is the form of Judaism that maps closely to that? Well, you've got Louis Finkelstein, who has a radio show called Eternal Light, which is about the ethics of Judaism, and he's on the cover of Time magazine. He's sort of the right image, like we respect the Jewishness of it, of the conservative movement, but we also want to be integrated and Americanized. And so conservative movement is flourishing of all the movements in the mid-20th century. But conditions changed by the late 20th and early 21st century. We've got a different demographic. We've got birth rates changing. We've got institutional strength and vitality. We've got money coming growing within the Orthodox movement that had not happened up till like the 60s and 70s. There were a couple of people who were main givers, but for the most part, kind of the wealth wasn't as accessible. And so the rise of orthodoxy or ultra-Orthodoxy, Haredi, I should say, in America is a function of greater tolerance, much more individualism. Every person can choose what they want. And also the rise of the welfare state and social services enables previously poor Jews who would have had to go out and work. Right now there are food stamps, and there's welfare, and there's healthcare that's now available for people who want to have big families. So things change and enable a movement that says we're going to center ourselves on the Beit Midrash and learning for quite a few years, and then we're going to use technology to telegraph that, but we're also going to decide how to treat secular culture sort of more antagonistically. And let's face it, for modern Orthodoxy that said we want to be part of America, American culture by the late 20th century, early 21st century is not so consonant with Orthodox values. So if you want to be modern Orthodox and say I'm fully American and fully Orthodox, well, there are many, many more rifts and wedges driven between that. So rather than say, is modern Orthodoxy successful? Is Haredi? I remind people, in the 1930s, nobody thought Haredi Judaism had a chance in America. Now, a lot of leaders...
Let's make sure I understand. So your argument, Professor Berger, is it's a narrow view, it's a parochial view to come and say, okay, conservative Judaism had, argument's sake, 3 million members in the 1950s, and exquisite synagogues in the suburbs, such as I was raised in, with 1,100 seats, and they had services here and there, and youth minions, and this and that, and it would be narrow and incorrect to say, and now we would say it failed because the numbers have decreased, and now everything is over Zoom, and people don't even drive to synagogue anymore because parking lots are empty. It's not a failure, it's a mutation in your language. How
I would actually call it as more of a selection.
Selection, okay.
In other words, and conservative Judaism, by the way, has its internal, again, air quotes, mutations going on. If you look at Hadar, look at the Chavurah movement of the 1960s and 70s, that was from within the conservative movement. The Ramah sort of branch of conservative Judaism is still in many ways flourishing. And then you have, more recently, the Hadar Institute and Yeshiva, which is every one of the leaders of that movement went through the conservative ordination or PhD program. So in some ways, it's like a branch, a mutation of conservative Judaism is gaining traction among some, but another, sort of the laity just being part of conservative Judaism, that is waning, that is dwindling. And Orthodoxy actually does a better job keeping its laity connected, but it's not without issues. And I just found that helping students understand that there aren't these essentialist ideas of what this kind of Judaism is or that kind of Judaism is, and it's right because more people are doing it. It is a success because it has more adherents. You could do the same thing with Kabbalah. Kabbalah was a small group, a kind of elite group of adepts who really studied, and they were overall pretty secluded and withdrawn from the wider society in their small groups in Tzfat. Then we learned that with the printing press, more people are learning about it. Okay, we'll leave aside the whole Shabtai Tzvi fiasco. But Hasidism is a movement that starts relatively small. And you could say they succeeded. I would prefer to say is, what were the conditions of late 1700s Eastern Europe that so many people made the choice, I want to follow this form of Judaism and kind of either leave behind or fuse in some ways what I got from my more traditional training and growing up, and what Hasidism has to offer. Same thing with neo-Hasidism today. We tend to think that's the solution. We need to I wouldn't want to draw the conclusion that because neo-Hasidism, which actually started out within Jewish renewal and then kind of now it's also within the Orthodox community in a big way, that therefore the right lesson to draw is we need to insert Kabbalah or Hasidic texts into an elementary school curriculum. It's not because it's right. It's meeting a need. It's responding, but it existed before. It's not like any of the Netivot Shalom he wrote it decades ago, and now there's an audience for it. And I'm interested as a scholar of religion, what are those conditions that now made authors like Netivot Shalom or other Hasidic and Kabbalistic ideas, why are they gaining so much more widespread traction and acceptance? And here again, I want to talk about the general turn towards spirituality, interiority, away from dogma, away from classic texts, which are associated with elitist ideas, and spirituality is accessible to everybody. But read the work of Robert Wuthnow, right, where he talks about the rise of spirituality in American religion from the 40s to the 80s. So we're in this larger, if you will, sea with currents and movements and waves, and we're part of that too. And I don't want to say, I think the wrong lesson to draw is because Hasidism is true and we've been ignoring it all along. That's what I really want my students to avoid.
So if we go back to the Second Temple time, the selection there, what was the selection post Second Temple? Are we just saying Sadducees out, Essenes out, Qumran out, and Rabbinic Pharisee Judaism is the selection, at least post Bar Kokhba? Is that again a wrong way to look at things?
No, I wouldn't say. I just want to make sure that when we say out, it's not that it's ejected in any way. It's the same way we might talk about those who left Orthodoxy in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because it didn't fit the world, whether Eastern Europe or America. We're not saying out to Orthodoxy. It's simply going to be attractive to a smaller number of people. And I would argue that great luminaries in the Orthodox world, whether it was the Eish Kodesh, who, Chovata Talmidim, that he writes in the 1920s, he realizes the old way of training is not going to work. When Rav Kotler Zatzal started Lakewood, right, he had a vision, I don't think he anticipated the incredible success in terms of numbers, but he would have stuck with his motto, which is, given the conditions, I think this is the best form of Judaism. And if it would remain the province of a small group, he would believe in it because that's just part of the mutations that are possible in mid-20th century America. And you have some people, now the destruction of the world that it came from had a lot to do with it. But think about Israel. Israel is another great example of, in the mid-20th century, it's a secular Israeli leadership. It's a secular culture. It's after the Shoah. Right? There's just a couple of hundred people still holding on. It's in a of course it's responding to the world around it. I'm not saying that it's ignoring it, but let's just say, for argument's sake, the Israeli government didn't give subsidies to people based on number of children or the educational systems or rabbis or kashrut, whatever it was. If they wanted to be totally separation of church and state, it's hard to know what the expansion and growth, really the explosive exponential growth of Haredi life in Israel would have looked like, right? So I don't want us to fall into the trap, which is very easy in the 21st century, that numbers indicate success. Now let's go back to post-Second Temple. If the Sadducees are going to focus on sort of a temple, what we call cultic center, and it's now 100 years after the Churban, and now you don't have anybody alive who remembers the temple and what went on there. And it's moving more into hope and prayer rather than actual being part of one's life. So I don't know when the Sadducees ended up dying out. Maybe they certainly didn't leave things behind for us to know about their existence. But what I want to say is that there was a group, and we now have I think historians have really focused a lot of attention on that 150, 200 years after the Churban. The rabbinic community was a relatively small community. Probably the biggest sea change in the history of rabbinic Judaism in the last roughly generation and a half of scholarship is that mid-20th century, the dominant view was the rabbis were the leaders. That was the accepted view because we have the texts and we know the names and we don't have any other names. So they must have been the leaders. And historians say, well, what evidence could we discover that would corroborate that or challenge it? And we're finding synagogues that have considerable iconography that the rabbis didn't approve of. Well, if they were the leaders, why would they allow this? And are we seeing a breakaway shul? Is that what we uncovered with the mosaics? Or is it that the rabbis had their domain and there were a lot of other Jews who were doing, what the late Jew would do, is like they kept some form of Shabbos, they kept some form of kashrut, and maybe people started to notice that these rabbinic circles were growing, but we don't have the massive yeshivot that we're going to have in a couple of centuries. And I would argue that, interestingly enough, the rise of Christianity, but especially the rise of Islam, takes the rabbinic community and says, these are your leaders. The wider society, right? First of all, it's a homologue, right? It's homologous with Chazal. There is a revealed text like the Torah. There is Sharia or some kind of law. There are jurists. There is an oral tradition, hadith, right? So since rabbinic Judaism, which had been around now for several centuries, had a self-understanding and a structure and a form of life very similar to what the Muslims were promoting. So it's natural that people will default to the form of Judaism most like their host society. And
not the opposite. No one can make the argument that all of these features of Islam were copied from
Absolutely.
Judaism.
But I don't, that's a much harder thing to press because we
Because
know,
they were the hosts, they had the numbers, they were in power.
and they had some awareness. I don't know exactly how early Islam would have developed, but I don't think it was a straight imitation of Jews because Jews were a very small minority and not that central. But what I do want to say is, and one of the best examples is, I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with the polemic between the Babylonian Talmud and the Yerushalmi that happened, in the post-Talmudic period. Um, the Galilee, that northern Tiberias, that area was where the Yerushalmi, and there were still yeshivot that were relying on the Talmud Yerushalmi. And then there were the Jews of Mesopotamia, that Sasanian Babylon, that had their yeshivot, Surah, Pumbedita, Naharda, etc. And there were like two communities. In 750, the Abbasids conquer or take over the Muslim empire from the Umayyads, and they create a new capital city called Baghdad. And that becomes the center of an empire, literally an empire that stretches across North Africa to Spain, right? And east to Afghanistan. It's huge. And where do they plop their center? Just around the corner from Surah, Pumbedita, Naharda. In other words, that area. So that the Bavli becomes the dominant Talmud for almost all of world Jewry isn't surprising because the same way the New York Jewish community is riding the crest, right? If you know your colonial Jewish history, Philadelphia was the center of Jewish life. That's why JPS, Jewish Publication Society, right? That was in the mid 1800s. That was the center. But as New York grows and it becomes a hub for immigrants, and all kinds of Judaism are flourishing there, but the New York community is going to get stronger because of the economic and cultural and not so much political, but the centrality of New York, population wise and leadership wise. It's easy to sort of ride their crest. So rather than say, look, the Babylonian Talmud is clearly better. Now, there were things about it that were very good, but I wouldn't use that as the Makkah B'Patri. Like that must be the only reason that it flourished. It flourished because a world around it was buoying it, was encouraging it. And if you can use my term from earlier, the wider world was selecting the Talmud Bavli as the preeminent source of Jewish life. I think it had a lot of inherent reasons for it. I teach a course on Talmud here at Emory, and I have Jews as well as non-Jews, and I want them to understand things are meeting needs. And here I really want to emphasize the fact that the Muslims said to the Jews, "You will be autonomous." They need a text that's going to help them determine how to live according to their own laws. They had to run their own society. Well, if that's the demand from the external, if I look at the Bavli, or I look at the Yerushalmi, I'll do a much better job governing myself if I have the Bavli in front of me, because it has many more cases, it has many more sources, it has wider discussions. It is a more productive text for a group that wants to govern itself. So the Yerushalmi, in essence, doesn't fail, but it doesn't meet a need. And I'm being overly simplistic because we know that there were still yeshivot that considered themselves loyal to the Talmud Yerushalmi. They didn't want to give that up because, after all, they said the Mishnah was written here. We were the first ones. You in Bavel quote Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. They were here. So when it was unbroken, they felt that there was a strong reason to stick to tradition. But it was very hard to resist the wider conditions that, in essence, selected the Bavli as the premier source of Jewish life and self-understanding.
You said in the beginning that one of the the things that you try to get across, that you try to get across to your students is that Judaism and the Jewish people are not always objects of history, but are subjects of history. What's the balance? Because we're talking about trends and influences, part of the Islamic society, part of the Christian society. How do you create that in the scheme of things, this balance of being a subject of what's around, and but yet being, the subject and deciding this is what, this is what I am selecting.
That's an excellent question. And I really present it to my students as a both and rather than as an either or. As I said earlier, and I want to emphasize, I wanted to bring back to my students to understand that religious people see themselves as agents, that they're not simply, as you said, objects that, well, if there is a mystical movement in Spain, then we have to come up with, right? We're going to respond by coming up with our own. I don't know if that's the case. There was always a mystical tradition, that that was interested in some notions of transcendence and some notions of the supernatural, and some more metaphysical and systematic, others less so. We have Heichalot literature in the late Second Temple period. We have Sefer HaBahir. It's not that no one is interested in this. What I want my students to be aware of is, first, the landscape at any given time is diverse. And that's where Jews are subjects. They are acting, they are making decisions, they are trying things, they're exploring. And I'm not going to say they're exploring in hermetically sealed bubbles. Obviously they're aware of but they're not just responding. They're not saying, we're fine being rationalists, but oh my gosh, there are all these mystics around us. We better come up with a mystical version of Judaism. Religious life is itself so polychrome, so nuanced, so diverse, because people are trying to develop aspects of their lives and their hopes and their social lives in ways that live up to some kind of religious aspiration, ideal, values, and people are always trying out different things. And I wanted to restore that sense of agency. So what I like to do, and it's not a bright line distinction or thick wall. What I like to do is to say things tend to arise with Jews as subjects. They come up with these varieties of Judaism. And it might just be a few people that might write something or whatever. Think of all the books or Sfarim throughout history that were written and then later on really become popular. And if you will, Jews are a little bit more object when we start to evaluate the traction, the spread, the adoption of some of those forms of Judaism by more and more people. That's where I would say conditions tend to make more of a difference, not in the ideology, not in the birth or germination of a lot of these ideas, but rather in their reception, the audience they find. That's where Jews tend to be that I would say that the fate of ideas or approaches to Judaism probably depends more on the wider society. So move away from the idea that this is right or this is true or this is successful, but think in terms of what religious ideas, what religious values, what religious sensibilities does this type of Judaism or this approach tend to uh, uh, emphasize, uh, cultivate, live out in a very, very positive way. And then I asked the question, okay, why did it spread? Why did more Jews at the time adopt it? Sometimes they're adopting it just because it's what's available. In other words, sometimes, I mean, think about Chabad. Chabad is a great example. In the last 10 years, census writers, the people who go in and do demographic studies of Jews, and usually in cities, their federations love like doing these self-studies. I think it was in 2000, about 10, that they succeeded to convince the demographic sociologists or people doing the data collection to ask a question about Chabad. It used to be, are you Orthodox, conservative, reform, unaffiliated? And it says, now you can say, I belong to Chabad. Now, that doesn't mean that there are that many Chabadniks, but the reality is that a lot of people might be living in a place and they're looking for a certain kind of Judaism. They may grew up in one movement, but they moved to Florida. Chabad has many, many centers or houses. They go to campuses. Students didn't come in as members of Chabad, but on campus, they're looking for a place that feels like home, that they're accepted, they're not judged, right? And so the next time they go out and maybe they marry and have kids, they'll look for Chabad. So it's not that Chabad ideology is true in some comparative sense, and that's false. But it meets a need, and it's a form of Judaism that is flourishing in the conditions of early 21st century, not only America, but in many, many other parts of the world. So I really chose this language, and I'm glad you're pressing me on it, because I was worried that other vocabulary, other terminology leaves students with a sort of a false impression of how religion develops over history, that it's just a reaction to other people or to other conditions, but that no, people are struggling with what they think is a meaningful form of religious life, but also seeing that success is not a function of being right. And that I wanted to get those adjectives, right or wrong, out of students' minds, and not even being careful, like failed and succeeded, to be careful it flourishes or it's just not supported by the environment anymore. Okay. And humility is really where I wanted them to end up, because they're so used to their world of data. Data proves this is right or this is wrong. And it says, actually, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Let's talk for a second, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to use this word. Let's talk about false messianic movements. Okay. Shabtai Tzvi movement tore the Jewish world asunder. Families fighting internally, people selling, their all their worldly possessions and losing everything. Fights breaking out on the European stock markets. And we call it a false messianic movement. Where does that fit into this schematic of Jewish history as you present it?
Gershom Shalom, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, of course, who had the tome on Shabtai Tzvi, he himself wrote a book called Dvarim Bego. It's like about his life as an intellectual in first Mandate Palestine and then Israel. And he speaks there about the tension of being a scholar, which requires him to be removed and objective and analyzing things, but also being a member of this nascent country and society that he's able to contribute to and be part of. So there again, the subject object, right? He's that tension. So if this were late 1665, I wouldn't be prepared to call Shabtai Tzvi a false messiah, because he was making claims that some people believed, some people didn't, and it remained to be seen what would happen. It's very easy to say after his defection and conversion to Islam that he's a failed messiah, but I would argue even the terminology failed messiah or false messiah is probably, that's the word, I'm sorry, you used false messiah. That's something we can only know after the fact. And that, I think, is the Rambam's view. The Rambam's view was, we never know if someone is Mashiach. Anybody who comes and succeeds in the following, whatever, half dozen ways, then we know he's Mashiach. But not because we know he's Mashiach and we have to back him no matter what. So I, as a historian, I would say we have somebody who's claiming he's the Messiah. We have a lot of people who believe him and are acting, in very strong commitments to that belief. We have what's probably a significant minority, certainly of rabbinic leaders, who are opposed and brand him somebody who's making false claims. And then it played out the way it played out. But when it's happening, right, and I don't think you could claim with certitude that the right word is false Messiah. But I'm also not saying Messiah, I'm saying claims to Messiah. And you can have that in more modern times, with different groups. I remember I was in New York right before we left to Atlanta, was when the Rebbe died. And I had just defended I was about to defend my dissertation. It was 1990. Sorry, I had already defended my dissertation. That was 1992. I had gotten the job in 1994 in Emory, and we were making the move, and we were packing, and then the Rebbe dies in June of 1994. Well, the night before he dies, it was on the news that there are all these people behind police lines, and there was a woman, clearly, a member of the Chabad movement, who was interviewed by a news reporter who says, he's suffering, but we believe that he won't die. He's going through this because of our sins, and he's going to get through this. But I said, wow, suffering for our sins. Where have we heard that before? Like, as a scholar of religion, you could see that some people who are holding on to hope and, things are not going in that direction, they're trying to make sense of it. Now, when we first moved to Atlanta, we already saw here that there were some, what came to be known as Mishachistim in terms of the Chabad movement, but many of the shluchim here in Atlanta were not. So the movement itself was splitting, and I remember people in New York telling me 90% of Crown Heights are Mishachistim, and and it may have been true, but I would say, again, as a historian, some were saying the Rebbe was, some were saying the Rebbe wasn't, right? And it's going to work itself out one way or another. And it may, if it pulls too strongly in the Meshachist direction, we might see a breakaway, and that the wider Jewish community is going to have to eschew Chabad because of embracing that view, or it'll move in another direction, and those who are Meshachistim will become the small minority. Think of them like a Qumran, and over time, they may or may not survive. We don't know, it's hard to know. So I teach, when I do my overview of the history of Judaism, I talk about messianic movements, rather than calling them false messiahs. So,
How, perhaps in conclusion, how do you apply the model, the Darwinian mutated selection model? That's, we've got all three words in there. Okay. Um, how do you apply that and teach the rise of Zionism and certainly the establishment of the state of Israel, perhaps the divide of world Jewry between Israel and the diaspora? And a harder question, how would you apply these theories in order to try to predict the next stages in Jewish history and Judaism?
so I'll start with the last question is um, I don't predict stages. I indicate trends that are
Hmm.
going on now. And I said something can come along and just dramatically change everything, and you won't recognize it. Like you just won't recognize, like, how
Absolutely.
did this happen? Um, and I think that that's always happened. I think the speed with which those things happen has been um, uh, accelerated through technology and things like that, because we could just spread ideas much, much more quickly. But just as an example, uh, you know, 1994, 95, I would have said one thing about the religious Zionist community, but after the assassination of Rabin, and it was by a member of that community, you know, that created a certain kind of pull in another direction that people were now questioning, have we gone too far? So sometimes just one event can just make people rethink, even on their own terms, not because of external pressure, just their own self-doubt about, I'm thinking of Yoel Ben Nun, who was a strong believer in Eretz Yisrael Hashlema, but he realized that he kind of felt that he'd been taken in. But going back to your earlier question, the first part of your question, so um, you cannot mistake some early religious Zionists um, at a time where nobody was even talking about it. You're talking about Alkali and Mohilever. They're talking about, because nationalism is in the air, and they could talk about, well, we've been a nation, maybe we could start thinking in this direction. And it was such a minority of a minority, like nobody. There were so few Jews relative to in Palestine at the time compared to the Jews of Eastern Europe. But there were some dreamers who was at least questioning, is the idea of a miraculous messianic return to the land the only possibility? So they're exploring this idea in other ways. And then it also starts to get traction among some secularists. But when the pogroms begin in 1881, 82, and Jews are saying, okay, well, relying on or putting our hopes in the world around us is probably not a recipe for success, because they've turned on us, right? And they're slaughtering us in the streets. And the government that we kind of hoped would relax rules and integrate us, they're either allowing it or behind these pogroms. So the loss of confidence in the secular, I mean, the the national state as freeing the Jews and giving them an option. And then focusing on Eastern Europe, then you
But
have
but
people
the
like,
major reaction to that was emigration. That
correct, exactly,
million Russian Jews land in America.
correct.
Yeah.
And it was a lot easier, and it didn't require a total change of your belief system, although it changed your practice probably a lot. But Leo Pinsker writes Auto-Emancipation, and he has some ideas. And so now it's just growing, from the grassroots up. A couple of people are talking about it. You have other people to talk to, right? Because of the turn to anti-Semitism. And then when Western Europe also proves that anti-Semitism has not been expunged. Um, so again, now you have secular people, and that people say, wow, remember that book that Mohilever or Alkali wrote? And suddenly, other people who are really, brilliant, um, start to think that maybe there's something here. Like Rav Kook is writing about his ideas of the renaissance of Jewish national life, not just because of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism actually plays a relatively small role in Rav Kook's overall philosophy. But he does think about the dynamics going on here, and he's trying to understand what's going on from a perspective of Hashgacha Pratis, and he has a lot of confidence that the world is unfolding in a way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. And let's face it, Zionism remains a minority movement until World War II, when people realize, oh my gosh, if we don't have our own state, not tens or hundreds, not even thousands, but millions of our people will be destroyed. So no one could have predicted World War II, the extent of the destruction, the extent of the annihilation. If Hitler, Yamach Shemo, had remained in Germany and just made life difficult for German Jews, and even sent them to concentration camps, but never invaded East, never invaded West, just remained, I don't think Zionism would have taken off. Some people, there would have been more people who say you have to worry about a Hitler, there needs to be a sanctuary, but the idea that it's an existential need, that sort of Jabotinsky's idea of, right, we need to fight and build our own country, the revisionist Zionist, I don't think there would have been as many people embracing that. And for American Jews, when Louis Brandeis says, oh, but to embrace Israel, which at the time, remember when it started, is a secular, ethics is important, democracy is important. Louis Brandeis can say in 1915, or thereabouts, to support Israel, to support Zionism is to be a good American Jew, to be a good American. And he's equating that, and Todd Endelman has written that, especially in England, but then later in America, that becomes a source of Jewish identity that allows me to Americanize, but not assimilate entirely. So, whereas before that, religion was the exclusive way to fashion a separate, a distinctive identity, I should say, within America. Distinctive. In other words, I want to Americanize, but I want to hold on to something that keeps me distinctive. Zionism proved to serve that need. And then with World War II and so many refugees and survivors coming to America, that sense of never again. So the two together, a strong Israel and a Holocaust remembrance, fuse to make Zionism very, very, what should I call it, current and typical and default. That's what you automatically were. We're seeing the fraying of that, because it's not that Zionism is failing. It's not that the Zionist argument is failing. It's that the way people think about Jewishness and integration into America and whatever it might be, and personal flourishing in the very, very individualistic environment of America. Well, the Zionism and being a Zionist is already saying, I belong to a nation. That doesn't work so well with a hyper individualized sense of personal identity in America. So it's not that Zionism is failing, or you can blame the policies of this government or that government. It's that the selection that drove so many Jews, the majority of Jews, towards Zionism. Interestingly, and I'll close with this, think about it. In the Haredi world, the majority were pretty opposed to Zionism. I think if you look at the yeshivish community, I don't think you have that same, yes, about drafting, that's still an issue, but there is certainly a pro-Israelism in the American Haredi community that you didn't have 40 years ago. And yet the solid wall in the reform and conservative movements toward, in the Zionist support, their children and grandchildren, there it's fraying because their sense of Jewishness is in terms of ethics and values and the way the media treats Israel, it becomes more uncomfortable for them too. So it could be that in the next 30 years, God forbid, but it could be that Zionism becomes a minority movement again. outside of Israel. It could be. It wouldn't shock me. It wouldn't, would I lament it as a committed Jew? Yes. But as a scholar, I would say, right, again, the forms of Zionism that have sprouted, and there are many, right? We don't really understand in America that there are really many kinds of Zionism, and how popular it is and how many people subscribe to it or support it. Times of the hour are changing, and the selection is not as unanimous behind Israel as it had been in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We're starting to see the ruptures or the cracks in that wall. And so I think this overall helps us accept, and also, by the way, to work for it, because I can be that agent. I can be that actor. I could be that acting subject, that doing, choosing, deliberating, and getting involved agent, rather than just sitting back and saying, well, what can we do? It failed. I think that's too pessimistic, too fatalistic, and it's not true.
Professor Berger, this has been absolutely fascinating. Our listeners and viewers who would like to read more or see more about this, where do they go?
That's a
Online
much.
lectures, online presentations, writings.
I'm still working on it to
Okay.
see the right forum, so I don't have too many places where it could be. I mean, I have tapes of my Emory classes, but that's internal to Emory. I have not publicized it, but I do think that in my own sort of talks that are going out there, this is the approach I take. I don't always name it, a Darwinian approach or the Darwinian model. When I teach in an academic setting, I just think it's easy for people to realize that mutation is happening naturally, and the selection is happening naturally. And so because they know the terms, I use it, as an analog for religion. And some of my students still write to me that it really helps them understand. And by the way, some of my students who are of other faiths, they find tremendous, traction in this idea for their own traditions to understand it. So if they're committed to a form, of Christianity that is right now suffering demographic decline, if they believe in it, I say, go fight for it. It's not dependent on you to succeed, but it's not, you shouldn't have the self-doubt that just because a lot of people are not filling the pews the way they once did in your denomination, that there's something wrong, or you missed the truth. So
Again, Professor, thank you so much. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
okay, very best of luck. Thank you for doing this great work.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.